Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Wacky D&D Characters. Today we are completing the character that we rolled up last week, which was a Goliath monk bard who is only allowed to use melee weapons. One caveat that we had was that our unarmed strike did count as melee weapons, although they're not technically weapons, they are melee attacks. So we included those in there. So this is our first level character. You can see we are a first level monk, a Goliath. We took the noble background. We have the lawful neutral alignment. And that is that. We've got a pretty good armor class starting out at 17. We'll roll through our stats real quick. We put one of our 10s from our ability score rolls in strength, and we get a +2 as a Goliath in strength and a +1 in constitution. We put an 18 in dexterity, and you might already be saying, okay, what's going on if he's putting a 12 in strength and an 18 in dexterity and he's only allowed to use melee weapons? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. We put a 15 in Constitution, which went up to a 16. Dumped a 10 in Intelligence. Wisdom was a 16, and Charisma is a 13. This build kind of suffered from having low ability score improvements and modifiers, obviously. I would say only roll with this character if you have godlike stats. Obviously, a point buy is going to get you a little bit better, but unlike most character classes, you really only have 2 dump stats. In most character classes, you can have anywhere from 3 to 4 dump stats, and it not affect you too terribly much in combat and in your skills and that kind of thing. But this one, you have to have 4 to do what we want to do. You have to have 4 good stats, that is. So you only get 2 dump stats, and unfortunately we have like 3, so things aren't great. So as you get into the higher levels with this class, if you don't have amazing stats, what you're going to want to do is make sure that you buy some sort of magical items that will augment some of these. Strength and intelligence are always going to be dump stats, but your charisma and your your constitution and wisdom, you're gonna want to get up to around 18. Charisma, you're gonna want to get that as high as you can, and you'll see why once we get into the 5th and 12th levels. But we'll stay focused on level 1. Proficiency bonus is 2, as always. We have saving throws in strength and dexterity. When we get to level 20, all of these will be filled out. We took the stealth, persuasion, perception, intimidation, history, athletics, and acrobatics skills. We have quite a few at level 1, and we're only going to get more. It's one of the things I like about bards. You get quite a few. Monks, you get quite a few extra as well. As far as skills go, they're really, really good. Passive perception, 13. Languages, we know Common, Giant, and Elven. We have no armor proficiencies. We are proficient with simple weapons and short swords. We have a tool proficiency of leatherworker's supplies, poisoner kit, alchemy supplies, and dice. We don't ever do anything with these, but kind of just thematically thinking about the character, I liked this kind of tool proficiency plethora to kind of go through and just have something to pick from and just something to do. Thought it worked out pretty nice. Starting out, we really actually don't have that much. We've just got the Dungeoneer's pack and then Fine Clothes, Signet Ring, Scroll of Pedigree, but we do have quite a bit of gold to spend if you want to pick up some dice or some of these other actual tools that you have proficiencies with, so that you can get off the ground using them at level 1. Our initiative is +4, that comes from our dexterity. We have a base walking speed of 30. That's going to, yeah, we don't have that at level 1. Let me make sure. Yeah, we don't have an armored movement at level 1. but going forward you will get an unarmored movement that will buff this base speed. Current hit points 11. Again, we are using the average rolls for all of these characters that we're rolling up. So if you wonder how we get to the hit points, we're not actually rolling them because that might give you a skewed view of what you can expect. So instead we're taking the average. Let's see what our personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws are. Common folk love me for my kindness and generosity. Despite my noble birth, I do not place myself above other folk. We all have the same blood. Our ideals, or our ideal, it is my duty to respect the authority of those above me, just as those below me must respect mine. Our bond, I'm in love with the heir of a family that my family despises. I hide a truly scandalous secret that could ruin my family forever. So this has very little bearing on the character that we are making, a monk bard that can only use melee weapons. But again, you can pause this and read through it now if you want. I will read it at the end of level 20 like I did last time, and it'll give you an idea for why we took these traits. And I think it works out very well thematically with this character. I think this character, more than the last one, has a good backstory, nice and solid. A lot of things to live for, to play for, a lot of side quests that could come out of this character, so it's just something to look forward to, and again, we'll get to that once we get to the end of level 20. I will read that out. Stone's Endurance comes from our Goliath. We can use a reaction to roll a d12 plus our constitution and reduce the damage by that number. We can do that once per long or short rest. We're going to get quite a few things at level 20 that are going to reduce our damage, and it's phenomenal. And the way this kind of works out is that you're almost a tank. If you had a few more hit points, you would be a tank. But I think with this damage reduction and a few other abilities that we get to avoid taking damage altogether, this is a very viable build for a party tank, despite it not really looking like that at first blush, just based on the stereotypes of a monk and bard. As a Goliath also, we have powerful build. We count as one size larger when determining carrying capacity and the weight that you can push, drag, or lift. We are mountain born. That acclimates us to high altitudes, 20,000 or more feet, as well as cold weather, so that's good. In the campaign that I play in, we just went into a cold cave, and we weren't there quite long enough to take too many effects of the cold weather. But if I had been a Goliath instead of an Aarakocra, wouldn't have had to worry about the cold so much. We get unarmored defense, which makes our AC 10 plus Dex plus Wisdom, which is phenomenal, and that starts us off with our 17 AC. And again, that's why you want to get this Dexterity and Wisdom as high as possible, as quickly as possible, so that you can get your armor class up. And again, your Constitution is going to increase your hit points, so you're going to want to get that up so that you can be a better tank. And then later, once we get into Bard, your spellcasting ability and save DC is based off of your Charisma. So you're going to want to get that as high as possible, as quickly as possible, so you can be effective as a spellcaster. Position of Privilege. This comes from our noble background. And basically, people are just inclined to think the best of you. They think of you as a noble. Common folk accommodate you, and you can secure an audience with a local noble if you need to. Blue eyes, gray skin, bald hair, 300 pounds, 7 feet 10 inches, and 18, so pretty young Goliath. I think it's going to be pretty interesting in your mind to think about this 7'10" Goliath doing some of these monk things, but it further implements that he's kind of a tank. He might be a monk, but his job is to stand there and to try and take as many blows as possible. And I think that's all that's on here for now. We'll start using all three of these boxes once we get into level 12 and 20, because we get quite a few different features and things. So after I got finished looking over this, I was like, wait a minute. We have key things, but nothing to do with key. So I went back, checked in the book. I got a little ahead of myself with the key. You don't get that until level 2, but you do start off at first level with martial arts, and that's going to explain why we are dumping into dex instead of strength. So I'm just going to read the 3 bullet points that kind of identify what we're doing with this character, or some of the special abilities of the monk class. So you can use your dexterity instead of strength for the attack and damage roll of your unarmed strike and monk weapons. So what that means is, for our unarmed strike and our quarterstaff, which is going to be our monk weapon, we can use our dexterity. Then anything that is a finesse weapon or a ranged weapon, which we're not allowed to use, but we do get darts just from, I think, our class equipment. We could use those as well. But again, from the restrictions, we're not allowed to use them. So that's how our quarterstaff, we're able to use the +6 instead of it being a +3. And again, our unarmed strike, that's going to explain that as well. So you can roll a d4 in place of the normal damage of your unarmed strike or monk weapon. This die changes as you gain monk levels, as shown in the martial arts column of the monk table. And I had completely forgotten to update that. I did update it where it was in the detail section that die changed, but I didn't update it here, so I'll have to remember as we go along that I need to update that. But then the last thing is, when you use the attack action with an unarmed strike or a monk weapon on your turn, you can make one unarmed strike as a bonus action. So basically you can punch with 2 hands in one turn. So there's a couple things that kind of the monks get the short end of the staff from what I have seen in my actual game. So the first thing is your unarmed strikes are pretty much always d4, even if you're not a monk. I can't tell you how many times I've punched somebody as a ranger and rolled a d4 instead of just the 1 damage that it technically should be. The other thing is your offhand strike. I want to say, and again, it's because it's every game I've ever played in. I'm not sure if that's just a house rule that coincidentally everyone has had. I haven't actually looked it up. But every game I've ever played in, you can always take an offhand attack. You just may not add your proficiency to that if you aren't proficient with 2-weapon fighting or something like that. There's always some sort of house rule that typically gets thrown in there. But so that kind of nullifies this last part of the monk class, is your ability to basically take a bonus action to do a second unarmed strike, as well as the d4 damage type. But that d4 will increase up to a d8, and I think even d10 once you get up to level 20 of monk. It may even go a little bit higher. We only made it to level 14 with this build in monk. So I think we are all done with our level 1. I'm going to close this out. We'll pull up level 5 and we'll go from there. Alright, we are back. As you can see, at level 5 we have 3 levels of monk, 2 levels of bard. Again, we are a Goliath, lawful neutral. Nothing has changed here with our ability score numbers, but they will at level 12, and that really happens in, I want to say, our 7th and 8th level that we take. So monk level 4 and bard level 4, we use our ability score improvements to basically take up our charisma, and I think our wisdom is what we do. It might be constitution as well. But what we're doing is, as you'll see in a second, we have gotten to the point where our ability scored numbers aren't where they need to be to really be viable in some areas. And so we're trying to, instead of taking feats, to get those numbers as high as we can. And again, if you roll well, or if you do point buy and get a little bit better than these stats show, you won't need to maybe spend the second or even the first necessarily ability score improvement on actually improving your ability scores. You'll be able to pick up 2 extra feats, which would be quite beneficial. But with the builds we're using, with the ability scores we're using, we had to use both of them in order to get to a point where even we felt a little bit better. It still doesn't get us to a great point. But again, by the time you're getting to level 12, 20, you're going to have a lot of magical items that will hopefully help you above and beyond just your ability score improvements might. So keep that in mind. Now, we do have some new skills: acrobatics, athletics, history, insight, intimidation, perception, performance, persuasion, and stealth are now all some of our skills. And we got a few extra once we took a couple levels of Bard, which is quite nice. And I believe at this point as well, we are getting the Jack of all trades, which allows us to apply half of our proficiency bonus to skills that we are not proficient with, which is why you now see Arcana. We normally have a 0. We have a 1 in Arcana now. And that's going to be super beneficial as we get higher and higher in level. And especially by level 20, you'll see that our skills are really pretty decent. Whereas, you know, just your regular old ranger who doesn't really change anything, there's not a lot of magical items that give you proficiency in skills. That's not a very common thing that people look for. So we get to the point where some of our proficiencies are crazy high, and even our lowest ability score is still pretty decent. So this is a pretty good utility character as well as the tank build that we're going for. Passive wisdom is still 13. I don't believe any of this has changed. Oh, we did get a few more actually when we took Bard. So we now have Leatherworker, Poisoners, and Alchemy Supplies, which I think we had before. But now we also have Brewer's Supplies, which works well thematically with our Drunken Master Monk. And then we also pick up a Flute. And we are using our Flute as our spell focus. Again, that's something you'll have to work out with your DM, like we saw last character. A flute isn't traditionally a spell focus. Although bards, I believe, allow you to have your instrument be your magical spell focus. So that should work out just fine. We are now up to 5d8. Thankfully, bards and monks have the same hit dice number, so calculating all this out was much easier. And at 5th level, you will have 43 hit points if you take the average scores. All of this has remained the same. We have added a few things over here though. Bardic Inspiration. We have 86, and because our ability score modifier for Charisma is only a 1, we only have 1 Bardic Inspiration dice. So you'll have to be careful how and when you use that. Jack of all trades, we already talked about. Song of Rest. After a short rest, if you perform for your party, they regain a 1d6 extra hit points. It's really valuable, especially if you're already low on hit dice. Maybe you've gone through several encounters and spent hit dice already in another short rest. And then on top of that, if you're a low level, now obviously we're already up to level 5, but a lot of times spending your hit dice doesn't get you back up to full. This 1d6 can be something that puts you above the top. Also, can't tell you how many times Cure Wound has been cast and you roll a 1. So having another potentially 1 is better. 2 hit points is always better than just the 1. Unarmored movement we talked a little bit about in level 1, but our speed increases by 10 if we are not wearing armor or shield. I think by level 20 that goes up to 25. So that's a pretty big improvement, especially if you're looking to take the dash action. Now we are up to a total movement of 80. That's a good way to close the gap on your opponents. Alright, so this box is mostly going to be our key stuff. I think towards the end we get a little short on space and a few other things find their way in here. But for the most part, this is going to be everything referring to our key points. So 13 is our spell save DC. We are allowed to take Flurry of Blows, Patient Defense, and Step of the Wind. And I'll just read out what those do real quick. They're pretty basic. Most everybody knows what they are, but maybe if you're new to D&D, you won't. So Flurry of Blows. Excuse me. So last time I had a cold and the sniffles all the time, and now my voice is going out on me. So you'll have to deal with that this week. So Flurry of Blows, immediately after you take the attack action on your turn, you can spend 1 key point to make 2 unarmed strikes as a bonus action. Basically, it gives you an extra attack. Already, you get to use 1 unarmed strike as a bonus action. This lets you just use 2. So it's 1 extra attack, not too bad. Patient Defense, you can spend 1 key point to take the dodge action as a bonus action on your turn. So again, as we were talking about with this Stone's Endurance, it's another way to kind of avoid damage, is to take that dodge action. Step of the Wind, you can spend 1 key point to take the disengage or dash action as a bonus action on your turn, and your jump distance is doubled for the turn. So again, a way to disengage if your tankiness turns out to not be so tanky and you need to get away real quick. And let's see, what else do we have? Drunken Technique, so this is from our Drunken Master. When you use Flurry of Blows, you gain a disengage action and walking speed increases by 10 until the end of your turn. If you add that to your unarmored movement of 10, plus your base speed, if you start in melee combat with somebody, you can hit them 3 times and then walk 50 feet away, which is much higher than most creatures' base speed. So that's a very good way, again, to get in, do some damage, get away to avoid damage. And potentially you'll be hopefully sucking up aggro and having the beast come after you. And again, it's another way to be a tank with your low HP. And also deflect missiles for your monk. That's a pretty standard one everybody knows about. If something tries to shoot you, you can use your reaction to deflect or catch it. You roll a d10 plus your dex modifier. If you so you either reduce the damage, or if it's reduced to 0, you're able to catch it and throw it back with a key point. So now we are getting into our spell casting. We are going to be a bard, charisma, spell save DC of 11. Most of our spells aren't going to need a spell save DC, and our spell attack bonus won't really come into play too much. But if you want to adapt this and use some spells that are more offensive, again, we are limited to only using melee weapons. So if you want to take some spells that are more offensive in nature, you're going to want to find a way to get your spell save DC and your spell attack bonus up as high as possible, as quickly as possible. So our cantrips, Blade Ward, and True Strike help us deal damage, Bane, Cure Wounds, Healing Word, Fairy Fire, Heroism. A lot of these are buffing spells, which are really, really good. I really like all of them. Cure Wounds and Healing Word, we're going to drop one of those later. They're kind of redundant, especially since we only have 3 spell slots. But Healing Word basically is a ranged Cure Wounds. It's also a little bit less effective than Cure Wounds is. So that's the one that I believe that we drop later on, just because it's not as effective overall. Fairy Fire is really good. It helps you get advantage on your opponents if they start in this Fairy Fire and fail their save. But again, we've got a pretty low save, so you're going to want to try and get that up. I would rely more on True Strike than I would Fairy Fire, just because our spell save is so low. And that is pretty much our level 5 character. It's really not too bad. I would put it on par, maybe a little bit weaker than some of my characters that are typically pretty good at damage output. But this is a really good utility character, and it's very good at what it does at getting in, doing some damage, getting out, avoiding taking damage, and just kind of being a monk, and really that kind of drunken master image that you kind of conjure in your mind of trying to be elusive, evasive, avoiding damage, redirecting damage. It's a really good character overall, I think, so far. So we're going to close all this out again, pull up level 12, go through it real quick, and see what we have at that point. So again, it's something that maybe doesn't make a lot of sense for your as a feature. Let's start that over. Let's just cut that out and start over with what I was trying to say there. So those are two things. Let me just start completely over.